The hills of eastern Appalachia did not soften in autumn. They darkened. The trees shed their color early up in those elevations, and what was left behind was gray bark and black branch in the deep silence of a landscape that had decided it was done being generous for the year. The roads turned to mud with the first cold rains, and the mud dried into ruts that broke cartwheels and twisted ankles, and nobody fixed them until spring, because nobody had the time and nobody had the money, and that was simply how things were in the hollows and ridgelines of that country. The farms sat far apart from each other, separated by tree lines and stone fences, and the kind of distance that accumulates when men do not particularly want to see their neighbors. Most of them were struggling. A few of them were not. The ones that were not struggling all had something in common, which was that they had found a way to make other people's hardship work in their favor. This was not spoken aloud. It was simply understood. Harlan Voss's property sat at the top of the only real hill in that stretch of county, a wide stone farmhouse with a slate roof and iron-fitted gates at the end of a gravel drive. It was not a beautiful place. It had the look of something built to last rather than to please, all right angles and thick walls and small windows that let in the minimum of light required for function. The fields around it were managed with the same philosophy, not fertile, not loved, just productive. Voss had owned the land for 20 years. Before him, his father had owned it. Before his father, a man whose name Voss did not mention and whose portrait he had removed from the front hall within a week of inheriting the deed. He was 52 years old and built like the hills themselves, broad and solid and utterly indifferent to beauty. His hair had gone gray at 40, and he had not seemed to notice or care. His eyes were pale and quick, the eyes of a man who was always counting something, always arriving at a number and filing it away for later use. He employed 6 people in the house and the outbuildings. He paid them what he decided they were worth, which was slightly less than they needed to leave and slightly more than they needed to starve. He had calibrated this number over many years of practice, and he was quite precise about it. The servants slept in the low building behind the kitchen, 3 rooms between 6 people, a single wood stove that was lit in the evenings and banked before midnight. They were fed twice a day. They were expected to be grateful, and they were expected to be quiet, and most of them, after enough years, became both. Callan Graft had come to the farm at 17. He was 28 now, which meant 11 years of carrying and hauling and cleaning and fixing, 11 years of mornings that started before light and evenings that ended well after dark, 11 years of keeping his head down and his opinions to himself. He was lean in the way that comes from never quite having enough, with rough hands and dark hair kept short, and a face that had learned over a long time to show as little as possible. His father had been a woodworker in a small town 2 counties east, a man who built good furniture for other people's houses and could never quite manage to build something solid for his own future. He had died of a chest fever when Callan was 16, coughing through a winter that would not end, and left behind a set of good tools and a list of bad debts. Callan had sold the tools to pay half the debts and worked the other half off with his hands. By 17, there was nothing left to sell and no reason to stay, and he had walked to Voss's farm because he had heard there was work there. There was work. That part had been true. What no one had told him was that work and a future were not the same thing, and that in Harlan Voss's house, they were not even distantly related. He stayed because leaving required money he did not have and somewhere to go that he could not name. He told himself for years that he was waiting for the right moment. At some point, he stopped waiting and simply started enduring, which is a different thing entirely. Quieter, heavier, much harder to see from the outside. He had been in the lower storage barn the morning she arrived, sorting through the last of the autumn grain inventory, counting sacks in the gray light from a single high window, when he heard the commotion at the gate. Cord's voice first, loud and certain, the way it always was when Cord had decided something before he had finished thinking about it. Then a lower sound he could not place from inside the barn. He finished the count he was on before he went to look. The habit of finishing tasks before investigating anything else was 11 years old and very difficult to break. By the time he pushed through the barn door and crossed the yard, it was over. She was on her knees in the gravel near the gate, and Cord was standing over her with one hand on the collar of the dog he had brought out, a big gray-brown animal that was still pulling toward her with its ears forward and its teeth showing. 2 of the stable workers stood nearby with the expression of men who want to appear uninvolved while watching closely. Callan had seen orcs before, twice in his life, both times at trading caravans that passed through the region every few years. He had seen them from a distance, the way everyone in these hills saw them, from behind a fence or a window, never quite close enough to read the details. He knew they were larger than humans, and that most of the stories told about them in the county were told by people who had never spoken to one. This one was younger than he had expected. Mid-20s, he would have guessed. Her skin was the color of deep pine shadow, the kind of green that lives in old forests. She had dark hair matted with road dust, and her face was thin in the way that spoke of many missed meals, a sharpness in the jaw and cheekbones that did not belong to someone who had been eating regularly. Her clothes were rough spun and worn through at the elbows and knees. No pack, no weapon, nothing of value visible on her. She had the look of someone who had walked until there was no more road and then kept walking anyway. Harlan Voss came down the front steps in his morning coat, not hurrying. He never hurried. He had the kind of authority that did not require movement to announce itself. He looked at the orc on his gravel with his pale eyes moving quickly, and Callan watched from across the yard and saw the exact moment the calculation happened. He had seen that look on Voss's face before. It was the look of a man arriving at a number. She was large, even half-starved, clearly stronger than any of his current workers. She had no papers, no clan markings anyone here could read, no one who would come looking. She had come to his gate asking for food or work, which by the informal laws of that county made her nobody in particular. Voss spoke to Cord without looking away from her. He said she would work off the disruption she had caused. He said a week's labor would settle the trouble of it. He said it in the tone he used for all his decisions, the tone that meant the matter was closed before anyone else had finished forming a thought about it. The orc understood enough English to know what was being said. Callan could see it in the set of her jaw. Not fear, something harder than fear. The flash of a fury very quickly controlled, pressed down and held in place by the cold calculation of someone who understood exactly what her options were in that yard, in that county, in that year. She had come looking for food. She had found something much worse. And she knew it. And she knew that knowing it changed nothing at the moment. They put her in the far side of the courtyard with the stones. Her name, Callan would not learn for 4 days. Not because she refused to give it, simply because no one thought to ask. Voss's workers did not need names, they needed to function. The first morning, Callan carried a water bucket past the yard on his way to the storage rooms. He had used that path for 11 years. He was not looking at her. He had the careful habit of not looking at things in Voss's house that he was not supposed to be looking at. But he slowed. Her hands were bleeding. The stone she was hauling had edges that had not been worked smooth, and her palms were open and raw, and the blood had dried brown in the cold air, and she was lifting the next stone anyway. He set the bucket down near her feet without stopping and kept walking. He did not know why. The action had happened before the thought that preceded it could fully form. She looked at the bucket, then at his back. Neither of them said anything. He thought about it for the rest of the day. That evening, he made sure there was an extra portion left near the far end of the courtyard wall, set behind a loose stone where it would not be visible from the house. He did not watch to see if she found it, but in the morning it was gone. The second morning, he did the same thing with the water bucket. The third morning, he brought a small, folded cloth and vinegar, diluted in water from the kitchen, and left them near where she was working. By the fourth morning, he was crouching beside her in the gray light before Cord took his position on the wall, working at the dried-out wrappings someone had eventually given her, which had not been changed and were now worse than useless, more likely to hold infection than prevent it. He worked carefully. He had learned wound care from his mother's older sister, a woman in his home county who had been the nearest thing to a healer for miles in any direction. He knew that cuts left dirty would not close. He knew that cuts left unclothed in cold air would crack open again with the first heavy work. He cleaned what he could, tore 2 strips of clean linen from the inside of his work shirt, where the fabric was less worn, and rewrapped both hands with the methodical attention of someone who intends the work to hold. She watched him the entire time. Not the way most people watched when their hands were being tended, with the distracted relief of someone grateful to be helped. She watched him the way she watched everything in that yard, with a steady, direct attention that assessed everything it landed on and filed it away. Orcs, he was learning, looked at things straight. They did not have the human habit of polite indirection. The sliding gaze that says, I see you, but I am pretending not to. When he finished with the second hand and sat back, she said one word, Sable. He looked up. She was watching him. He understood. He told her his own. Callan. She repeated it back quietly, testing the shape of it in her mouth. The second syllable gave her something to work with, and she settled on a pronunciation that was slightly different from how he said it himself, but close enough that he recognized it, and something about the careful way she worked it out, the small private labor of it, made him feel unexpectedly seen in a way he could not have explained. He told her he would come back the next morning to change the wrappings. She did not say thank you. She picked up a stone and went back to work. He went back to the barn. On the sixth morning, while he was rewrapping her left hand, she asked why he was doing it. He kept his eyes on the bandage. He said honestly that he was not entirely certain. He said he thought it was because it needed to be done and no one else was doing it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that among her people, tending someone's wounds was not a small gesture. It was a statement of allegiance. Not friendship, not yet, not necessarily ever, but allegiance. She said he should understand what he was saying with his hands so that he could not later claim ignorance of it. He looked up at that. She held his gaze. Her green eyes were dark-rimmed with exhaustion, and they were also the most direct eyes he had looked into in more years than he could cleanly count. There was something complicated in her expression. Not warmth yet, not softness, but something that was considering the possibility of both from a careful distance. He said he supposed he understood. She nodded once, the way someone nods when a thing has been formally agreed to, and then looked back at her stone pile. He thought about that nod for the rest of the day. She began talking to him in the mornings, briefly, in the low, careful way of someone who was always aware of the windows above and the walls around. She told him small things first, the name of the ridge country she had come from, 3 days east. The way her people built fires, low and wide, not tall and narrow like the fires in this house, because the goal was warmth spread across a large space and not height or show. She told him that the herb teas Cord gave the workers for pain did nothing for her, but that willow bark, the right kind, worked the same for her as for any human. He started bringing her willow bark tea. She did not thank him in words for this, but she accepted it without checking it first, without the careful hesitation she had shown in the beginning, and she drank it without looking away from him. He understood that this was, for Sable, the equivalent of something significant. He told her things in return, the names of the other workers, which of the guards grew inattentive after midday, where the kitchen surplus was kept. Practical information, the kind that helps a person navigate the geography of a place they are trapped in. But gradually, the way that happens between two people who are both starving for honest conversation, the small things opened into larger ones. He told her about his father, about the tools he had sold, about the weight of a life that is hard not because of any single catastrophe, but because of the slow, daily accumulation of small diminishments, and how after enough years that weight becomes invisible to the person carrying it, which is somehow the worst part. She understood this without him having to explain it further. She said her people had a name for the condition he was describing, the gray walking. The period when a person moves through their days without direction, doing what must be done but feeling nothing pulling them forward. She said she had been gray walking for the better part of 2 years before she had walked into Voss's gate. He asked if she felt that way now. She took the question seriously, turning it over before answering. Then she said not entirely. Not today. He picked up the water bucket and went back to work and thought about those 3 words for the rest of the afternoon. What Callan understood about Sable in those first weeks was this. She was not surviving the way the rest of them survived in that house. The rest of them survived by becoming less, by narrowing, by learning to want as little as possible so that the distance between what they had and what they needed stayed manageable. He had done this himself over 11 years. He had gotten very good at it. Sable was doing something different. She was watching. He could see it in the way her eyes moved when she worked, tracking the patterns of the yard and the house and the people in it with a quiet, systematic attention that had nothing to do with obedience and everything to do with information. Where Cord walked his rounds and at what intervals. Where the shadow fell in the afternoon from the south wall, and for how long. Which sections of the courtyard fence line were visible from Voss's study window and which were not. She was building something in her head, some map or structure that he could not see but could feel the shape of in the things she chose to ask about. She asked him once, in the middle of carrying stones without looking at him, what was on the other side of the east wall. He told her, a lane, then 50 yards of open field, then the line of old trees that marked the edge of Voss's formal property. Beyond that, the creek road that ran south, and further south, the mill. She said nothing in response, but she adjusted the angle of her next stone haul by 3 feet, positioning herself slightly closer to the east wall than before, and he understood she was measuring the distance. On the seventh day, Voss summoned her to his study. Callan did not know this had happened until Sable came back to the yard an hour later with her face composed and her eyes carrying something new, a sharper and cooler quality than it had held when she left. He waited until Cord climbed down from the wall to take his midday break, and then he crossed the yard and stood near her without directly facing her. She said without preamble that Voss had offered her an arrangement. He waited. She said Voss had told her she was stronger than any laborer he had employed in the past decade. He had said that a week's work to settle the disruption she had caused could, with the right attitude on her part, become something longer term, something stable. He had used words like fair and practical and sensible. He had said it all in his quiet, reasonable voice. The voice that made everything he said sound like something that any clear-thinking person would naturally agree to. She looked at the stone in her hands. She turned it over once. She said the most frightening thing about Harlan Voss was not that he was cruel. It was that he genuinely believed he was being reasonable, that he had talked himself into believing that keeping her here was a form of doing her a favor, that he could not see the difference between an offer made freely and an offer made to someone standing in a locked yard. She said she had looked at his face when he spoke, and there had been nothing in it that she recognized as dishonesty. He was not lying to her. He was lying to himself, and he had been doing it for so long that the lie had hardened into something that felt, from the inside, exactly like the truth. She set the stone down. She picked up the next one. She said she had no intention of staying. He said he knew. She asked if there was anything in this property, any feature of it, any detail he had learned in 11 years that she might have missed in 7 days. He stood there for a moment. The cold came in from the tree line and moved through the yard with the flat, indifferent purpose of autumn air in those mountains. Then he told her about the passage. He told her it was under the east wing's foundation, a drainage channel from the original structure, nearly 100 years old, that ran under the east wall and came out in the ditch near the mill road. He told her that Voss had ordered it sealed years ago during the renovation of the east wing, but that the grate covering it had never actually been properly blocked, only covered with an iron plate and a stone weight, and that there was a lumber stack above it that had been there long enough to collect moss on the underside of the bottom boards. She went very still. He said he had known about it since his first year here. An older worker named Carver had told him, a man who was gone now, left or dead. Callan had never been told which. He said Carver had known from the man before him. She asked why he had never used it. The question sat in the cold air between them. He said he had asked himself the same question every year for 11 years and had never come up with an answer that satisfied him. He said the honest version was that leaving required something worth leaving toward, and for a very long time he had not been able to identify what that was. She was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the yard. Somewhere behind the storage barn, a door banged on its latch, and neither of them looked toward it. She said, "There is a reason now." He did not respond immediately. He looked at the east wall, at the old lumber stack half visible from where they stood, at the line of shadow that the south wall threw across that section of the yard in the afternoons. He said yes. She picked up a stone and carried it to the west side of the courtyard. He picked up his empty crate and went back toward the storage barn. They did not look at each other as they separated. But that evening, when Callan lay on his narrow board in the workers' room and listened to the other men breathe in the dark, he found that for the first time in a very long while, he was not thinking about endurance. He was thinking about the tunnel. He was thinking about the iron plate and the stone weight and the lumber stack and the shadow from the south wall and the specific timing of Cord's midday break. He was thinking in terms of variables and sequences, the way a man thinks when he has stopped merely surviving and has started, quietly and without announcing it to himself, planning. Outside, the wind moved through the old trees on the ridge above the farm, cold and purposeful, carrying the smell of the creek and the deep woods beyond it. The sound of it came through the gap in the low building's wall, where the chinking had never been properly filled. And Callan lay in the dark and listened to it, and thought about what it meant that a person could know a way out existed for 11 years and never move toward it, and what it finally took to change that. He thought he was beginning to understand the answer. In the yard, Sable lay against the anchor post in the cold with her re-wrapped hands flat on her knees, eyes open, looking at the east wall. She was not thinking about what came next after the passage. She was not thinking about the mill road or the creek or the first beyond Voss's eastern property line. She was thinking about her mother's notebook. The slim, leather-covered volume that Cord had taken from her coat pocket the first morning, that Voss had presumably looked through in his study and found unremarkable, a collection of plant drawings and remedy notes in a script no one in that house could read. She was thinking about it the way she thought about her mother, with a directness that bypassed sentiment entirely and went straight to the essential truth. It was the only thing left. Not the only valuable thing. The only thing. Everything else from before had been shed or lost or left behind in 2 years of gray, walking through a country that had no interest in her. The notebook was what remained. She had looked for it everywhere she could see from the yard. She had not found it yet, but she had not yet had reason to look inside the main house. She would need reason. She looked at the east wall for a while longer. Then she closed her eyes and let the cold do what it would and waited for morning. She had been planning the escape since the 5th day. This was something Callan understood only in retrospect, looking back at the weeks before it happened, and reading the pattern of her movements the way you read a map after you have already traveled the territory. The stone placements near the east wall, the angle of her work routes, the way she had asked, in those quiet morning conversations, about the gap in the fence near the drainage ditch and the depth of the lane behind the east wall, and how long the walk from the lane to the tree line actually was. Just curious, just making conversation. She had not been making conversation. She had been measuring. She went on the 22nd day. Callan was inside the storage barn running the week's tool inventory when he heard the silence. It took him a moment to identify it as unusual. The courtyard had a sound when Sable was working in it, the steady rhythm of stone on gravel and footstep on packed earth, irregular but constant, the way water sounds constant even when it is not. When that sound stopped in the middle of the afternoon, the absence of it was a thing you could feel. He heard Cord's voice next, not the normal midday tone, something else, shorter, harder, than the dog's. He set down the tool he was holding and went to the barn window. The small high glass showed him the east wall of the courtyard, the lumber stack, the section of fence beyond it. Nothing unusual. He crossed to the barn door and looked out, and Cord was crossing the yard at a run toward the east gate with both dogs on long leads, straining forward, noses down, ears flat, and the courtyard behind him was empty. She had made it over the wall. He stood in the barn doorway and felt something move through him that he could not immediately name. Part of it was fear, not for himself. Part of it was something else, something closer to the feeling you get when you watch a bird leave a windowsill, a single suspended moment before it either clears the roof or does not. He went back to the tool inventory. His hands worked through the count, but his mind was elsewhere, following the route he had described to her. The lane, the open ground, the tree line, 40 paces into the trees. Shemaz, that was where they found her. He would learn this later. Cord's dogs were trail animals used for exactly this, and 40 paces was not enough. The tree line was close, but the forest was not thick enough near the edge to slow the dogs, and she had not yet reached the creek that might have masked her passage, and so 40 paces in, they were on her. She went down without fighting them because fighting Cord's dogs would have been a different kind of ending entirely. And Sable was practical about her endings. They brought her back through the property gate in the early morning gray, with her wrists rebound and her face cut from the undergrowth, and her eyes pointed straight ahead at nothing in particular, at the middle distance, at some internal focal point she had identified and was using to hold herself together. Voss came down the front steps in his good coat to receive the report. He stood on the gravel and listened to Cord with his hands behind his back and his pale eyes moving between Cord's face and Sable's, and his expression was not what Callan had expected. He had expected anger. He had seen Voss angry before, the contained, cold version of it that was somehow worse than the loud kind. But this was not that. This was satisfaction. The expression of a man whose suspicion has been confirmed, whose estimate of a situation has proven accurate, who has learned something useful. He looked at Sable the way a craftsman looks at a material that has just demonstrated an expected property under expected conditions. He was not surprised. He had, it was clear, been waiting. He spoke to Cord for several minutes. Then he looked at Sable. He said she had cost him a night's sleep and several hours of his man's time. He said this was going to be accounted for. He told Cord to double her daily work assignment and reduce her food ration by a third. He said she was going to come to a proper understanding of her situation and that this particular lesson was a kindness compared to what wandering orcs found in other parts of the county when they caused trouble. He said this last part without any particular emphasis, the way a man states a fact of geography. Then he went back inside. They chained her to the anchor post in the yard that night, hands above her head, the chain just long enough for her to sit against the stone wall with her back straight. The cold came in from the ridge around 9 in the evening, and by midnight it was serious. Callan lay in the workers' room and listened to the wind and thought about what he was, not what he had done, not what he planned to do, what he was. Specifically, what 11 years of keeping his head down and his mouth shut had made him, and whether the man that process had produced was someone he would choose to be if he had been given the choice, which he had not been. Or had he? Was that the thing he needed to think about? Whether he had in fact been making a choice every single morning for 11 years and had simply been telling himself he was not. He thought about what Sable had said on the 6th morning. Tending wounds was a statement of allegiance. He had made the statement. He had been making it every morning for 2 weeks with clean linen and diluted vinegar and willow bark tea left near the courtyard wall. He had been saying something with his hands and his habits and the extra portions left behind loose stones. He had been saying it clearly and consistently, and he had simply not yet decided what it meant. He decided that night. Before first light, he crossed the yard and crouched beside her in the dark. She was awake. She looked at him with the same steady, measuring attention she had shown from the beginning, worn now, hollowed somewhat by cold and failed effort, but structurally unchanged. The core of her was intact. He said he was sorry it had gone wrong. Just those words. No explanation, no qualification. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said she did not need his pity. He told her it was not pity. He said it was something else, and he did not have the precise word for it, but pity was not it. She asked what he was going to do about it. He said he was still thinking. She told him she had been thinking too. She said there was something she had noticed while carrying stones along the east foundation wall, a detail she had filed and not mentioned because she had not known what to do with it yet. She said the grate he had described to her, she had found it, had stood over it, had felt through her boot soles the hollow sound the ground made around the iron plate. She said the lumber stack above it was positioned to create a shadow corridor along that section of the foundation wall for most of the morning. She said the angle of Cord's position on the east wall had a gap in it, a section of the courtyard floor he could not see from his post without leaning significantly over the edge. And it was not the section with the stone piles, which he watched closely, but the section near the old foundation wall, which he had stopped watching because nothing was ever there. Callan went still. He knew all of these details individually. He had known them for years, but she had assembled them into something he had never assembled himself. A sequence, an argument, a plan with a shape, and the shape of it was exact. He said he needed to get her out of the chains to work the plate up, and she could not do it alone with her wrists raw and her ration cut to almost nothing and her arms already up for most of the night. She said she knew. She said they needed to wait for the right day, and then they needed to move together. No hesitation, no second assessment once the moment arrived. She said she had learned from the first attempt what happened when the plan had a gap in it. There would not be a second gap. He said he understood. The morning bell rang somewhere in the house above them. He stood and went back inside before Cord came down from the bunkhouse. Pell found out that day. Callan was not certain exactly when or exactly how, but by afternoon Cord was watching him from the wall with a different quality of attention, and by evening Voss called him into the front hall and stood him in the entry with the mud-colored floor and the single lamp, and explained in his reasonable voice that he was deeply disappointed. He said Callan had been a reliable member of the household for a long time and that he had extended a degree of trust on the basis of that reliability. He said trust was a form of investment and that investments needed to produce returns. He said the ORC was a labor asset and that any interference with that asset's function was also interference with the property's function, and that this was not a distinction he would tolerate blurring. He moved Callan out of the workers' room and into the yard. His new sleeping place was the tool alcove on the south side of the courtyard, a roofed space without walls, open to the night air on two sides. He was given the same doubled work assignment as Sable, the same reduced rations. He was not chained, but Cord watched the east wall each morning, and the main gate was locked at night, and the dogs were in the yard from dark to first light. Voss delivered all of this in the same measured tone he used for everything. Not angry, not punishing, precisely. Correcting, the way a man adjusts the tension on a fence line that has begun to sag. The reasonableness of it was, as always, the worst part. The first morning they worked together in the courtyard, Sable did not look at him. Not immediately. She hauled stone from the east pile to the west with her re-wrapped hands and her straight spine and her controlled face. Cord watched from the wall. The cold was heavier that morning, the kind of Appalachian autumn cold that sits on your shoulders and does not lift. At midday, Cord climbed down from his post to eat. Sable said without turning her head that he had not had to do this. Callan said he was aware of that. She moved a stone from one position to another. She said she was not saying he should not have done it. She was saying she understood the difference between someone who had stumbled into a consequence and someone who had chosen it. And she wanted him to know that she understood the difference. He said yes, there was a difference. She set the stone down. After a moment, she said she was going to get them both out of this place. Not a hope. Not an expression of intent dressed up as a hope. A statement of fact about the future, said in the same tone she used to describe the weather or the weight of a stone. He said he was counting on it. What followed in the next 2 weeks was not comfortable, and it was not easy, and it was also in a way that Callan would have had difficulty explaining to anyone who had not lived through it, something else entirely, something that did not have a name in the vocabulary available to him. Voss's revised arrangement was designed with the precision of long experience. The work was calculated to exhaust by evening. The food was reduced to exactly the point where the body had to allocate everything to basic function and had nothing left for anything else. The cold was managed just well enough to prevent genuine illness, but not enough for sleep to be anything but a brief interruption of discomfort. He knew where every line was. Harlan Voss. He had spent a long time learning them. But two people working the same punishment were harder to fully exhaust than one. This was something Voss had perhaps not fully accounted for, the arithmetic of shared labor being what it is when both parties are paying attention to each other. Sable was stronger than Callan by a significant measure, the kind of physical fact that was obvious and required no commentary. She adjusted her work positioning on the heavy lifts to absorb more of the weight without making the adjustment visible from the wall, angling herself between the stone and Cord's line of sight and taking the heavier end without announcement. Callan moved faster on the tasks that required agility through narrow spaces, his smaller frame an advantage in the gaps between the stone piles and along the east foundation wall where the lumber pressed close. They did not plan this. They observed each other and adjusted. It happened over several days, gradually, the way two people learn a shared language by listening rather than studying. A shift in position here, a timing adjustment there. By the end of the first week, they were working as a unit so naturally that Cord, watching from the wall, would have seen only two laborers running their assignments. Nothing coordinated, nothing communicated, just two people doing what they had been told to do. In the gaps when Cord left his post, they talked, quickly and quietly, always aware of the windows in the wall. They worked through the details of the passage with the thoroughness of people who knew they would not survive a second failure. The iron plate was 31 paces from the lumber stack. The shadow corridor along the east foundation ran from the 7th bell to roughly the 9th, depending on the cloud cover. The lumber stack blocked Cord's sightline to that section of the courtyard floor from his post on the wall. Cord left his post for midday food on days when Voss was in the house. On the days Voss took his second guard with him to collect the quarterly land rents from the tenant farms south and west of the property, Cord was the only man on the wall through the morning. Those days came around every 8 or 9 days. They had been counting. Pell watched them with small, unhappy eyes from the kitchen doorway when he came out to the yard for morning and evening tasks. He was a man in his late 50s with a stooped way of moving that had not always been there, the stoop of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had stopped trying to stand up straight against it. He would look at Callan and then look away, and there was something in the looking away that was not cruelty and not triumph. It was the expression of a man who has done a thing he did not want to do because the alternative was worse. And who knows that this explanation, while true, does not make the thing itself any better. Sable read this before Callan did. She told him on a morning when Pell had been in and out of the yard twice on kitchen tasks, watching them in that sideways, uncomfortable way. She said it without drama, the way she said things that were simply facts about the landscape. She said Pell had not told Voss because he wanted to. She said she had seen that expression on different faces in her years of moving through human towns and villages. The expression of someone settling a debt they had not chosen to take on. Callan looked at her. She said Pell's family had owed Voss something for a long time. Not money, or not only money. Land, probably. The kind of debt that gets passed down because it is attached to the ground itself, and the ground cannot be separated from the people living on it. She said every piece of information Pell delivered was probably worth something against that debt. She said this was not a man who was choosing Voss. This was a man who had run out of other choices so long ago that the distinction no longer felt relevant to him. Callan looked across the yard at Pell's retreating back. He said he had known Pell for 11 years. She said sometimes the people we have known the longest are the ones whose situation we have looked at the least carefully, because familiarity produces a kind of blindness. She was not unkind about this. She stated it as a property of the world. He thought about that for the rest of the day. The counting brought them to the night before the 9th collection day. It came on a Tuesday, and the Tuesday before was a night of cold, clear sky and hard stars and a wind off the ridge that moved through the yard with a sound like something searching. Sable was chained to the anchor post as she was every night, the standard arrangement Voss had kept in place since her first escape attempt. Callan lay in the tool alcove under the single blanket he had been given, which was not warm enough but better than the floor of the courtyard. They were 40 feet apart in the dark. After midnight, when the house was fully silent and the dogs had settled near the gate, and even the wind had dropped to something barely above stillness, Sable's voice came across the yard, very quiet. She said she had not yet told him about her mother's notebook. He was awake. He had been awake for some time. He said he was listening, she told him. The slim, leather-covered volume that Cord had taken from her coat pocket the first morning, that Voss had gone through in his study while she stood in the yard below. Her mother's handwriting on every page, the plant drawings and the remedy notes in the script of her people. Years of accumulated knowledge in a woman's careful hand. She said her mother had died 2 winters ago, in the fever that had scattered what remained of her settlement. She said the notebook was the only evidence she had left that her mother had existed, had known things, had thought things worth recording. She said in the 2 years since she had kept it inside her coat, regardless of the weather or the road or the circumstances, because there was no longer a place she was going toward, but there was still a thing she was carrying with her, and that was a different kind of direction, smaller but real. The stars moved slowly above the gap in the courtyard's roof. She said she had decided she was going to get it back before she left this place. She said this was not a side consideration. She said it was not negotiable. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her he had seen it. She went still. He could feel the quality of attention shift from across the yard, a sharpening, the particular silence of someone who has just received unexpected information and is holding very carefully before responding. He said 3 weeks ago, before all of this, when he had still been doing the weekly cleaning of the main house, he had been in Voss's study running the lamp oil, and the notebook had been in the top left drawer of the study desk, which Voss left unlocked during working hours because he considered himself beyond the need for precautions in his own house. He said the study was on the ground floor of the east wing that sat directly above the drainage passage. The silence between them held a structure to it, an architecture. She said very quietly that the study was on the road to the grate. He said yes. She said 90 seconds, if they moved without stopping. He said probably yes. The wind came back across the ridge, softer now, moving through the bare branches of the old trees at the property's edge with a sound like breathing. The dogs did not stir. The house was dark in every window. She said there was one more thing she needed to say. She said it directly without the softening that most people added to difficult truths as a kind of apology for them. She said she had been alone for a long time before this, that she had become accustomed to it, had built her days around it, had learned to treat solitude as a feature rather than a condition. She said that over the past weeks, in the gray light of the courtyard mornings, in the cold of shared punishment, in the low conversations in the gaps of the watch schedule, she had slowly become unaccustomed to it. She said she was not certain she liked this, because it meant that tomorrow had higher stakes than it would have had if she had remained alone. He lay in the dark and looked at the stars and said he understood. She said she was not sure he did. She said she meant him specifically, not company in the general sense, not the abstract comfort of another person. Him specifically. He had no immediate answer for this. He lay with it for a while, the weight and the surprise of it, the quality of hearing a true thing said without any decoration around it. He said that feeling was not unreciprocated. She said she knew. She said she had known for some time. She said goodnight. He did not sleep much after that, not from worry, or not only from worry. He lay in the tulle alcove and listened to the property settle around him in the cold, and thought about the morning and the shadow corridor, and the iron plate, and the 90 seconds in the study, and the notebook in the unlocked drawer. And he thought about what Sable had said, and he thought about the feeling of having, for the first time in more years than he could account for, something that was not endurance but was also not yet hope. Something in between those two things. Something that required a word he had not found. In the early hours before the collection day bell, Voss came out to the yard. This was not usual. Callan heard the front door and opened his eyes and watched the shape of him come down the steps, big and unhurried, in his coat and boots, moving across the yard toward the anchor post where Sable sat in her chains. Callan lay still and watched through the gap in the alcove's wall. Voss crouched in front of Sable and spoke to her in a voice too low for Callan to hear fully. He saw Sable's face in the gray light, the controlled expression, the steady eyes. The conversation was brief. Voss stood up after perhaps 2 minutes and walked back to the house, and the front door closed behind him. Callan waited. When the house was fully quiet again, he said her name. She was quiet for a moment. Then she told him what Voss had said. Voss had said he knew about the passage. He had known since the day he purchased the property. He said he had ordered it covered but never properly sealed because he had found over the years that it served a useful purpose. He said a locked gate tells you how many people are trying to leave. A visible, climbable wall tells you how many people will try to go over it. But a hidden passage, imperfectly concealed, tells you something more specific. It tells you who in your household is desperate enough and resourceful enough and patient enough to actually find a way out. He had said he found this information useful. He had said this by way of letting her know the shape of what she was dealing with. Then he had gone back inside. Callan lay in the dark and felt the cold of the ground through the planks under his back and thought about what Voss had just said and all the ways it could be read. A warning, a threat, a test. The statement of a man who wanted her to know he was watching, that he had always been watching, that the sense of invisible movement through shadows and careful timing was not, from his side of the transaction, invisible at all. He said her name again. She said she had heard it. He asked what she was thinking. She was quiet for a long moment. The chain between her wrists made a small sound as she shifted position. She said she was thinking that a man who tells you he can see what you are doing before you do it is a man who has decided the telling is enough. That if Voss had intended to stop them, he would have sealed the passage or moved the grate or posted cord at the east foundation wall instead of the east perimeter wall. He had done none of these things. He had come out in the night before his collection day to make a speech. She said speeches were what a man made when he was no longer confident that the locks were enough. She said they were still going in the morning. Callan put his head back on the ground and looked at the stars through the gap in the alcove roof and breathed in the cold air of a night that was almost over and felt something settle in his chest. That was not peace exactly, but was the thing that comes just before a decision, stops being a decision, and becomes simply what you do. He said he would be ready. The yard was silent. The dogs did not stir. The house was dark in every window. Somewhere above the ridge, clouds moved across the stars and the yard went darker, and the cold came down off the mountain with the finality of an Appalachian autumn night that has decided it is finished with whatever warmth it had been holding back. Morning was not far. The collection day bell rang at the 6th hour. Callan heard it from the tool alcove where he had been awake for some time, lying with his eyes open and his hands flat on his chest, listening to the property come alive around him in the dark. The kitchen first, the sound of the stove being fed and the water bucket being filled. Then the stable, the low movement of the horses and Cord's voice in the early morning carry of cold air, giving the day's first instructions to the stable hands. Then the front door of the main house and the sound of boots on gravel and the gate chain being lifted. He turned his head and looked across the yard. Sable was already awake. She had been awake, he suspected, for longer than he had. She was sitting against the anchor post with her back straight and her chained hands resting in her lap, and her eyes on the front gate, watching Voss move down the drive in the gray early light with his second guard behind him and the collection ledger under his arm. She watched him until the gate closed and the chain was reset from the inside by Cord, who then turned and walked back toward the wall without looking at the yard. She looked at Callan. He nodded. She held up 2 fingers. 2 minutes, the time it would take Cord to climb the wall steps and reach his post. He stood slowly the way a man stands who is doing nothing in particular, no urgency in the movement, just the ordinary stiffness of a cold night working itself out of a body. He stretched his arms. He bent to pick up the empty water pail near the alcove door. The pail was his reason for crossing the yard to the well, the same reason he crossed it every morning. The same unremarkable errand he had run for 11 years. He walked toward the well, but he did not go to the well. He went to the kitchen door instead, the side entrance that the cook used for morning deliveries, which was unlocked from first bell to last. He pushed it open and stepped into the kitchen's warmth and crossed directly to the nail beside the inner door frame, the nail where Pell hung the chain key every morning when he came to start the stove. The same nail it had been on every morning for every year Callan had worked in this house. The key was there. He took it and went back out into the cold and crossed the yard to the anchor post where Sable sat watching him with the same focused attention she brought to everything she considered worth understanding. He crouched beside her and fit the key into the wrist chain lock. The mechanism was simple and old, and it opened on the first turn. He unwound the chain from her wrists and let it drop against the post. She looked at her wrists. The skin beneath was marked in red lines where the iron had pressed through weeks of cold nights. The tissue underneath pale green and tender. She turned her hands over once, looking at them not with relief but with the expression of someone taking an accurate inventory. Then she stood up. They were moving before the full 2 minutes had elapsed. He went first toward the kitchen door. She followed close behind, and they went in through the side entrance the same way he had come, through the kitchen warmth and out into the interior passage of the east wing, the secondary corridor that ran along the house's east side used for coal deliveries and laundry, smelling of wood polish and old coal and the accumulated indoor weather of a house that had been heating itself inadequately for a long time. Callan knew which floorboards carried sound and which did not. His feet found the safe ones without requiring instruction from his head. Behind him, Sable moved with a quietness that went beyond caution into something more practiced. The ingrained movement of a person who had spent years learning how not to be heard in spaces that did not belong to her. Her large frame navigating the narrow passage with a care that was structural, built into how she moved rather than applied to it from outside. They reached the main hall. The study door was closed. Callan turned the handle slowly with his weight already shifting back in case the door opened onto something unexpected. It opened onto the empty study. The lamp on the desk was unlit. The morning light came through the single east-facing window and lay across the desk's surface in a flat gray rectangle that illuminated the top clearly. Top left drawer. Sable crossed the room in 4 steps. She did not search. She knew where it was. He had told her, and she had held that information with the same precision she held everything. And now she went directly to the drawer and pulled it open, and her hand went in and came out with the slim leather volume, and she stood there for one moment with it in both hands. He had seen her face in many conditions in the weeks he had known her. In pain and cold and exhaustion and fury and the controlled blankness she wore for Voss. He had seen it in the early mornings during wound dressing and in the dark of the courtyard at night when the honest things were said but he had not seen what was in it now. She looked down at the cover of the notebook and her hands tightened around it, not gripping, holding, the way you hold something you were not certain you would ever hold again. She opened the cover. Her mother's handwriting was on the first page in the looping, precise script of her people. The characters formed with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had learned to write late and had made up for the lateness with attention. The ink was faded at the edges where the leather cover had not fully protected it from the damp of 2 years of roads and weather. But the center of each page was clear. Sable turned to the first real entry, a drawing of a plant, rendered with the specific accuracy of someone who drew not for beauty, but for identification. Every leaf position and root structure documented with the care that the difference between one root and another could mean the difference between healing and harm. Beside the drawing, her mother's notes in 2 languages, the ORC script, and below it, a phonetic rendering of the plant's common English name, added later in a slightly different ink, as if her mother had thought to make the knowledge accessible to whoever might eventually read it. She had been thinking of Sable when she wrote those English translations. Sable understood this with the cold, clear certainty of someone receiving a message that was sent long before the sender knew it would be needed. Her mother had been writing toward a future she could not see, leaving these small translations like stepping stones across a river, making sure the knowledge could cross even if the keeper of it could not. She closed the notebook. She pressed it flat against her chest for one breath. No more. Then tucked it inside her shirt against her body. She looked at Callan. He was watching her face. Whatever he found in it, he did not comment on, which was the right response. And the fact that it was the right response and that he knew it without being told was something she registered and stored alongside everything else she had registered and stored about him in the weeks since a water bucket had appeared near her feet in a stranger's courtyard. 90 seconds, she had said. They had used more than that. They went back into the hall, the east wing door, the yard, the lumber stack. 31 paces and they were there, kneeling behind it with the shadow of the south wall lying across them both, cold and precise. Sable put her hands on the iron plate. He put his hands beside hers. The weight was more than he had estimated from the outside. The rust had welded the plate to the stone lip around the grate in the way that iron and stone weld together through many wet winters, not fully fused but adhered, requiring not just lift but separation. He felt her hands adjust beside his, fingers finding in the gap between plate and lip, and he did the same, and they lifted together. The sound it made was a grinding, grating scrape of iron against stone that seemed in the still morning air to carry halfway to the county track. The cold sweat of it moved down his back. Cord did not turn. From somewhere in the stable behind the main house, one of the horses shifted in its stall and knocked a hoof against the board wall, and the sound of it was just large enough, just ordinary enough, to cover the grate's protest, and Cord on his wall heard a horse and not an iron plate. That was the difference between that morning and every other morning, the margin that is not luck exactly, but is the thing that luck gets misnamed for when people cannot think of another word for the exact calibration of preparation and circumstance arriving at the same moment. They shifted the plate sideways. The grate opened below them. Sable looked down into it. He watched her face as she assessed the opening, the same practical calculation she had applied to everything in that yard from the first morning. The passage was narrow. She had known it would be narrow. She had built this into the plan. He watched her make the specific decision that turns knowledge into commitment. The moment when a person stops evaluating and starts moving, and then she went in feet first and the darkness took her. He went in behind her, pulling the plate back over the opening as he descended, dragging it into approximate position above them. Not sealed, not perfect, but close enough. The light died. The passage was everything the smell had promised. Wet stone, old earth. The ceiling so low he had to move on hands and knees, the cold of the ground coming up through his palms immediately and completely. The darkness ahead was absolute. The darkness behind was the same. There was only the sensation of Sable moving through the narrow space ahead of him, the controlled sounds of someone larger than her surroundings working through them with determination and intelligence. Her shoulders finding the angles where the passage widened by inches, her breathing steady and deliberate. He counted. 10 paces, 20. At 23, his leading hand dropped into nothing, and he stopped and said in a whisper, Step down 4 inches. He heard her adjust. He stepped down and found the lower level with his foot and continued. 30 paces. 35. His leading hand hit a wall. He pressed his palms flat against it. Stone, same as the passage walls, but the mortar was different. Smoother, newer relatively. This was the blockage Voss had ordered and never completed, the work that had been begun and then abandoned, the seal that had never been sealed. He said her name in the dark. She was already there beside him, her arm alongside his in the narrow space, her larger hand pressing the wall surface with the focused attention of someone reading it through her skin. He felt her shift her weight, felt the small adjustments of her body in the confined space as she prepared herself. She said she needed a moment. He waited. Then her free hand found something on the wall surface near the passage floor. He heard her breathing change, a small alteration, not alarm, not fear, something more careful than either of those. She said there was something carved here. He went still. She traced it slowly with her fingers in the dark, reading it by feel and inference. He waited with his hands flat against the blocking wall and listened to her breathe. She told him what she found, a name, a year, 23 years before this one. Carved at the passage floor level, the level a person would be at if they were lying on their side in that narrow space with their arms extended toward a wall that would not move. Callan did not move for a moment. He was thinking about Carver, who had told him about the passage in his first year, who had learned it from the man before him, who had learned it from someone before that. He was thinking about the chain of knowledge that had passed this information from hand to hand through years of people trapped in the same yard and never quite reaching the same morning he was in right now. He was thinking about the person whose name was in the stone, who had been here before him in this same darkness with their hands against this same wall alone. She said she knew what it meant. A single person could not move this block from inside the passage alone. The geometry was wrong, the space too narrow for the leverage required, the wall too heavy for one set of arms in this position. The person who had been here before had understood this and had carved their name into the floor of the passage anyway. The last available act, the one small mark left to say that they had tried, that they had been here, that they had not accepted the ending without resistance. She said they were two. She positioned herself alongside him. Their arms were parallel in the dark, his hands above hers on the block face. She counted in the language of her people, and he followed the rhythm, and on the count they pushed. The block moved. It moved a hand's width, then another, the grinding of old stone on old stone, filling the passage with sound that no longer mattered, because the gap that opened at the block's edge brought with it a rush of cold outside air, living air, the smell of creek water and dead grass and open sky. And this smell was so different from the sealed dark of the passage that it hit like a physical thing, like something that had been owed for a long time and was finally being paid. They pushed until the gap was wide enough and went through. The ditch was shallow and brown with autumn mud, the grass flat and dead, the mill road 5 paces above them, running empty in both directions in the gray morning light. The tree line of the old forest that edged Voss's eastern property was visible beyond the road, dark and close and dense in the way of forest that had been growing for longer than anyone currently living can remember. They lay in the ditch for a moment, and neither of them moved. Callan became aware of his own heartbeat and then aware that it was slowing. He became aware of the cold and the mud and the smell of the creek somewhere below them and the color of the sky and the specific quality of light that falls on an open piece of ground in early morning in the mountains, flat and clean and indifferent and completely unlike the light in that courtyard. He looked at Sable. She was on her hands and knees in the ditch mud, her green face streaked with stone dust and old mortar from the passage, her dark hair flat with damp. She was looking at the tree line. He watched her face in the moment she processed what she was looking at, the moment the information resolved into understanding, and the change in her expression was not large. It was not theatrical. It was the small, nearly imperceptible shift of someone who has been holding something at maximum tension for a very long time and has just been allowed to release it by 1 degree. She looked at him. He thought she was going to say something. The moment had the shape of a moment that requires words, some marking of what had just happened, some acknowledgement of the passage and the block and the name in the stone, and the 23 years and the 11 years and the 7 weeks and everything that had accumulated between the first morning with the water bucket and this ditch. She did not say anything. She pushed to her feet, staying low, and held out her hand. He took it. She pulled him upright in one motion, her grip solid and certain. And then they were both standing in the ditch, in the gray morning light, and the tree line was there, and the road was empty, and there was no bell ringing from the house behind them. They ran. Sable set the pace in the direction. She went through the ditch at an angle that kept them below the road's sight line until they were close enough to the tree line to cross the road in 3 steps without being visible from either direction for more than a second. She moved through the undergrowth the way she moved through everything, finding the gaps that were not obvious from the outside, her large frame threading through spaces that should not have accommodated it by angling and adjusting in a continuous fluid negotiation with the terrain. Callan followed her steps exactly. He did not look back. She ran for a long time. When she finally slowed, the farm sounds were gone entirely, and the trees around them were old. The kind of old that means a forest has been left alone long enough to develop its own interior logic, its own light patterns and root systems in silences. She stopped at a stream, checked the direction of the current, turned south. He understood without being told. Water-mass footprints, water-mass scent. She had known this before she could remember being taught it. They followed the stream south for nearly an hour, moving in the shallow edge of it where the current was slow. The cold of the water coming through Callan's boots immediately and completely, and not improving. He did not mention this. He kept moving. When she finally let them stop, it was at a root bank where an old tree had partially fallen away from the stream's edge, leaving a wall of exposed roots and packed earth that created a natural shelter. Low-ceilinged and close, but out of the wind and out of sight of any path. They settled against the root wall. For a while, there was only the sound of the stream and their own breathing evening out from the run. Callan became aware, in the absence of any urgent requirement to keep moving, of the full inventory of his body's complaints. The cold in his feet, the raw scrape along his left forearm from the passage wall, the deep ache of sustained cold that lives in the shoulders and the base of the neck. He was aware of all of these things, and they did not seem particularly important. He was outside the wall. He said this out loud because he needed to hear it said. Sable said yes. He asked what they did now. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stream in front of them. Then she took the notebook from inside her shirt and held it in both hands. Just held it, not opening it, feeling the weight of it and the shape of it, the way you hold something you were not certain you would get back. He said he knew this forest slightly, not well, but well enough. He said there was a woodcutter's seasonal hut about 2 miles south, empty in late autumn when the cutting crews moved to lower elevations. He said they could reach it before dark if they moved carefully. He said it would have dry wood and a fire pit and walls on all 4 sides. She looked at him. She asked how he knew about it. He said he had made a habit over 11 years of knowing the geography of places he was contained in. He said it was a useful thing to map the territory around a place you could not leave freely, to know exactly what was out there and exactly how far things were. He said he had been doing this since his 2nd year at the farm and had never said it to anyone because there had never been anyone to say it to. She was quiet, taking this in. Then she said she had not thought of him as someone who had been planning. He said there was a difference between planning and waiting. He said he had been waiting, but some of the things he had done while waiting looked like planning from the outside, and the woodcutter's hut was one of them. She nodded. She put the notebook back inside her shirt and stood up, and they moved south through the old trees with the stream to their left and the cloud cover thickening above the canopy. They had been in the forest for nearly 3 hours when the farm bell rang. The sound carried through the trees at that distance as something faint and irregular, a tone that the distance and the leaves reduced to barely more than an atmospheric variation, a slight change in the quality of the air. But Sable heard it and stopped, and turned her head and listened, and Callan stopped beside her. She said Voss was back. He said he had been expected back at midday, which meant they had perhaps 4 hours of lead time, perhaps less if Cord had checked the yard before the bell. She said they needed to move faster. They moved faster. What Harlan Voss found when he came through his property gate was a yard with 2 empty workstations and a chain hanging loose from an anchor post and a water pail sitting beside the well with nothing in it. He stood in the middle of his courtyard for a moment without saying anything, looking at the empty spaces where 2 people should have been, and the expression on his face was not the satisfied calculation of a man whose prediction has been confirmed. Cord found the grate within minutes. The iron plate shifted sideways. The gap in the foundation opened to the cold air. He stood over it and looked down into the dark and then looked at Voss. Voss looked at the grate for a long time. He said nothing for nearly a minute. Then he told Cord to get the bees and two men from the stable and to bring his coat from the house. Cord said which coat? Voss said his field coat. Cord looked at him. In 11 years of working on this property, Cord had never seen Voss put on the field coat and go into the woods after anything. He had sent men. He had sent dogs. He had directed operations from the wall or the front steps or the study window. The field coat was the coat of a man who intended to go himself, and Harlan Voss did not go himself. Cord went to get the coat. Pell stood in the kitchen doorway as Cord went past. He had been in the kitchen when the bell rang, had heard Cord's voice change in the yard, had come to the door in time to see Voss standing over the open grate with his face doing something Pell could not immediately read. He stood in the doorway now and watched Cord cross to the stables and watched the two stablemen come out pulling their coats on and watched Voss stand in the center of the yard waiting. And he thought about what he had done and what it had cost and what it had bought and whether those two numbers would ever come to balance in any accounting that mattered. The nail beside the kitchen door frame held nothing. The chain key was gone. Pell looked at the empty nail for a long moment. Then he looked back at the yard where Voss was pulling on his field coat with the deliberate movements of a man who had decided something. Pell said nothing. He turned back to the kitchen stove and the pot that needed watching, and he did not go back to the door. They picked up the trail near the Mill Road ditch, the dogs ranging ahead through the tree line with their noses down, pulling hard, and Voss walked behind them with his field coat buttoned against the wind and his pale eyes moving through the trees with their quick counting look. And the two stablemen walked behind him with the uncomfortable silence of people who are not sure what they have been brought along for. The trail led south. Voss followed it. Sable heard them before she saw any sign of them. She heard the dogs first, the distant carrying sound of working trail dogs, a specific frequency she knew from the night 40 paces into the trees. She stopped and put her hand back toward Callan without turning, the signal they had used in the courtyard for weeks, the one that meant stop and hold and do not ask yet. He stopped. She stood for a moment with her head turned slightly, reading the direction and the distance of the sound, running something through her head that had nothing to do with mathematics and everything to do with years of moving through country that did not want her there. She was calculating terrain the way she had calculated the courtyard. The same assessment applied to a different kind of map. She knew this valley. She had followed this creek south for an hour, and she had been reading the ground as she went the way her mother had taught her, and the way 2 years of solitary travel had reinforced until it was not a skill, but a reflex. She had noted the way the creek widened 200 yards south of where they were standing. She had noted the quality of the ground around the widening, the particular color of the vegetation, the absence of large root systems, the flat spread of it under the dead autumn grass. She turned to Callan and told him to stay close and to step exactly where she stepped and not to deviate for any reason. He said he understood. She turned south and moved, and he followed her. The marsh opened up gradually, the ground softening under their feet in increments that were clear if you were paying attention and invisible if you were not. The dead autumn grass was the same color as the solid grounds grass, and the living springs beneath the surface had no visible expression in the cold weather, and there was no way to see it for what it was unless you had been reading ground long enough to feel the difference between solid earth and suspended earth through the soles of your feet. Sable moved through it on the route she had already mapped in her head, stepping where the ground was firm, angling around the soft sections that looked identical to the firm ones from a distance of 10 feet. She moved quickly, and she moved without hesitation, and Callan followed her steps with the complete fidelity of someone who understood, without needing it explained, that fidelity to those steps was not optional. The dogs reached the marsh edge behind them. She heard the change in their sound the moment their leads went taut, the handlers pulling them back from ground that gave under their paws, the confusion of the trail continuing into terrain that did not cooperate. She heard the handlers' voices, uncertain, calling back. She heard Cord's voice, then a different kind of silence, the silence of a group of people stopping. She did not stop. She reached firm ground on the southern side of the marsh and turned and looked back across it. Voss was standing at the northern edge with Cord beside him and the two stablemen behind them, the dogs still straining on their leads. The open span of the marsh between them and the far side where Sable stood. The distance was perhaps 80 yards. In the flat gray light of the autumn afternoon, she could see his face clearly enough to read it. She had been right about what he was doing in that yard the night he had come to speak to her at the anchor post. She had been right about what this pursuit was. It was not about labor value. It was not about property. It was about the face of a man who had spent 20 years building a structure of control so complete and so meticulous that its functioning had become invisible to him, had become simply the nature of things, and who was now standing at the edge of a marsh, looking at two people who had walked out through an underground passage and across open ground and into a forest and had not come back. He was looking at a gap in something he had believed was seamless. She held his gaze across the water and the dead grass in the distance. He said nothing. He made no gesture. He simply stood there with his pale eyes on her, and she looked back at him with the same directness she had brought to everything from the first morning in his yard, the same steady attention that assessed what it found and did not look away from it. Then she turned and walked south into the trees. The woodcutter's hut was where Callan had said it would be, half buried in leaf drift, its doors swollen in the frame from seasons of damp. It sat in a small clearing between two large oaks, with the quiet stillness of the structure that has been empty long enough to stop expecting people. Callan worked the door open with his shoulder, while Sable stood in the clearing and listened to the forest behind them. Then they were inside. The smell was old wood smoke and resin and mouse, and the close, dusty smell of a space that has been shut for months. Against one wall, a stack of dry split wood, an iron pot rusted at the rim, a fire pit with gray ash in it, cold for months. Against the far wall, a sleeping platform of rough boards, nothing on it but the boards themselves. Callan built the fire. He had done it many times in similar places in the years before Voss, and his hands remembered the order of the work without requiring instruction from his head. The flint was where it always was in woodcutters' huts, in the left side crack of the chimney stone, by long regional tradition that no one had started and no one had ended, and everyone simply knew. He found it on the first reach. The tinder caught on the third strike, and the small flame it produced moved to the kindling with a quickness that felt, in that moment, disproportionate in its significance. The light changed in the hut. The cold changed. Not enough, not immediately, but moving in the direction of enough, which was all that was required. Sable sat near the fire and looked at her hands. The wrappings he had put on them last were ruined, dirty and damp, and partially unraveled from the passage and the run and the marsh crossing. The cuts beneath had reopened in places. She turned her freed wrists over and looked at the red marks left by the chain, the skin beneath pale green and tender, and then she looked at the wounds on her palms with the same inventory expression she had used in the ditch, accurate and forward-looking rather than backward. He sat down beside her without being asked and began removing the old wrappings. She held her hands still and let him, watching his face with the attention she had always paid to things she trusted enough to look at directly. He worked by firelight with the careful, practiced movements of someone for whom the care was structural now, built into the action itself. He tore two strips from the inner hem of his shirt. He cleaned the cuts with water from the stream carried in the iron pot, heated over the growing fire. He rewrapped both hands with the same tension he had always used, firm enough to hold, not tight enough to restrict. She watched him work. After a while, she said his name. He said yes. She told him that she had retrieved the notebook from Voss's drawer and had led them out of the marsh and had been the one to set the pace and direction from the moment they left the courtyard. And all of that was true. But she said she needed him to understand something about the accounting of the past 7 weeks, about what had actually happened in that courtyard and what had made any of this possible at all. He looked up from the wrapping. She said that among her people there was a distinction made between the act that starts a chain and the acts that continue it. The act that starts the chain is not always the most visible act. It is often so small that the person who does it does not recognize it as the beginning of anything. She said she had been in that yard for 3 days before he set the water bucket near her feet. She said she had been calculating the yard and the wall and the escape options, and she had been doing it correctly, and she would have made the same plan with or without him, and she would have failed the same way she had failed on the 22nd day, because the plan she had on her own was a plan for one person, and the block in the passage required two. She said the water bucket had changed the accounting, not because it was water, but because it was a choice, because he had made it in a yard full of people who had stopped making choices. And he had done it knowing what the cost might be, and he had done it anyway. She said that in a chain of events, the first link is not always the smallest. Sometimes it is the largest, and it just does not look that way from the outside because it does not make the most noise. He sat back and rested his hands on his knees and looked at the fire. He said he had not done it out of bravery. She said she knew. He said he had done it because he had been tired. Not the ordinary tired, the other kind. The kind that had been sitting in his chest for years, that no amount of sleep improved, and that had finally, in that courtyard, found the thing that was more present than the exhaustion. She said she knew this too. She said she had recognized it because she had been carrying the same weight for 2 years before she walked into Voss's gate. The fire cracked and the light moved across her face, catching the angle of her jaw and the dark of her eyes and the stone dust still in her hair from the passage. She reached into her shirt and took out the notebook and set it on her knee and opened it. She turned past the first page and found the entry she had been thinking about since the moment she had held the book in Voss's study. A plant drawing on the left side, the root structure rendered with her mother's precise, unsentimental accuracy. On the right side, the remedy notes, and below them, in slightly different ink, the English translation her mother had added later. Her mother had never spoken English. She had learned the words for these plants from the traders who came through, had asked for the names and written them down phonetically in the ORC script, and then had taught herself to form the English letters beside them. Uncertain and careful, the handwriting of someone doing a thing for the first time in middle age. The effort of it was visible in every letter. Sable looked at those careful, uncertain English letters for a long time. Her mother had not known who would eventually need them. She had not known that the settlement would scatter, or that her daughter would spend 2 years walking west through country that did not want her, or that the notebook would end up in a locked drawer in a farmhouse in the Appalachian Hills. She had simply thought, someone will need to read this who cannot read my script, and so I will make it readable. She had thought forward into a future she could not see, and she had left these small translations like notes tucked in coat pockets for a journey she would not be taking. Sable pressed her thumb lightly against the page, against the ink of her mother's handwriting, and held it there for a breath. Then she closed the notebook and held it in both hands, the rewrapped hands that still ached but would hold now, and looked at the fire. He did not say anything. He had been watching her face and had seen what was in it and had correctly identified the thing that was needed, which was not words. After a while, she looked at him. She said the feeling that she had described in the yard the night before, the feeling of having become unaccustomed to being alone. She said she had spent a long time managing that condition. The aloneness, had built systems around it, had convinced herself that a person could travel light enough and fast enough that the absence of others did not accumulate into anything significant. She said she had been wrong about that, and she had known she was wrong from around the 3rd week in that courtyard, and she had not said anything because saying it out loud would have made it true in a way that she was not ready for. He looked at her. She said she was ready now. He said he did not have a destination. He said 11 years in one place had left him without a clear picture of what came next, or where it was, or how to get there. She said she knew. She said that was not what she was talking about. He was quiet for a moment. The fire settled between them, and the hut was warmer now, genuinely warmer, the kind of warmth that earns its description. Outside, the wind moved through the old trees with the unhurried patience of things that had been doing the same work for a very long time. He said he thought he understood what she was talking about. She said she knew he did. She said she had known he understood it for some time. She said the question was not whether he understood it, but whether he was willing to say it clearly, which she had noticed was something humans sometimes found difficult, the saying of clear things. He said it clearly. She said yes. Then she said his name once more, the way she had said it from the beginning, with the careful attention she gave to things she considered worth getting right, and something in the sound of it in that small hut in that old forest settled into the air and stayed there. He put two more pieces of wood on the fire and lay down on the board platform with his coat pulled over him and looked at the ceiling where the firelight made moving shapes between the old rafters. The shapes moved in the draft from the chimney, and he watched them without thinking about anything in particular, which was its own kind of rest, and which was something he had not had, he realized, in more years than he could cleanly count. Sable lay near the fire with the notebook against her chest and her rewrapped hands at rest and her eyes closed. And the forest around the hut was old and dense and entirely indifferent to the small human dramas that played out in the structures men built at its edges. But it was not unkind, and the wind that came through the old trees moved around the hut rather than through it, and the fire burned steadily and the cold stayed outside where it belonged. 2 miles north, in the farmhouse on the hill, Harlan Voss sat in his study with the lamp lit and the top left drawer of his desk standing open. He had been sitting there for some time. The room around him had the particular quality of a space that has been very controlled for a very long time and has not changed. And the stillness of it was the stillness of control rather than peace, which are different things, though from the outside they can look the same. He looked at the open drawer. He was a man who had spent 30 years developing a precise understanding of what he controlled and what he did not. And he had been careful over those years to keep the two categories from contaminating each other. He did not reach for things outside his control, because reaching for things outside your control was how disorder started. And disorder was what he had dedicated his life to preventing. He looked at the open drawer for a long time, then he closed it. He set both hands flat on the desk surface and looked at them, at the familiar, unchanged topography of his own hands, at the things that had not moved or shifted or gone through a passage in the dark and come out somewhere he had not expected. He sat there until the lamp burned low and the study went darker around him, and the numbers he had always been able to arrive at did not come, and the yard outside the window was empty, and the only sound in the house was the sound of a building settling in the cold, the way buildings do when the night gets serious and everything inside them has gone still. He did not arrive at a number. He sat with the unfamiliar weight of that for a long time. In the morning there would be practical matters. There were always practical matters. The farm required managing, and the accounts required keeping, and the county required navigating. And all of this would continue in its established patterns, because that was what established patterns did. They continued with or without the specific arrangements that had been in place yesterday, but that was morning. Tonight, the drawer was closed, and the study was quiet, and the hill was dark. And somewhere in the forest, 2 miles south, a fire was burning in a woodcutter's hut, and two people who had each spent a long time believing they were waiting for something were discovering, in the warmth of that small fire and the weight of an old notebook, and the specific sound of a name said carefully by someone who means it, that they had not been waiting at all. They had been walking toward each other through the gray years without knowing it, by different roads and in different kinds of darkness, and the courtyard on the hill had simply been the place where the roads happened to converge. The fire burned through the night. The forest held. And in the morning they would need to figure out where they were going, which was a different kind of problem than the ones they had been solving. A better kind, the kind that has a direction rather than just a destination. The kind that two people can work out together if they are willing to move without knowing the full route in advance. They were willing. The night passed quietly around them, and the old trees stood in the dark the way old trees stand when they have seen enough of human circumstance to have stopped being surprised by any of it, patient and enormous and utterly unmoved. And the creek ran south below the hut over smooth stones in the cold, in the dark, running toward lower ground the way water always runs, without hesitation, without looking back, following the logic of the terrain toward wherever the terrain eventually opens out, which it does, it always does in the end.